Welcome to the Shame Free Sex podcast. I'm your host, Brielle Starr from shamefreesex.com. By tuning in today, you are taking your next bold step towards fully embracing your authentic sexual self, absolutely shame-free. It's time to take your power back from shame and experience the life of your dreams, both in the bedroom and beyond. Let's embark on this transformative, shame-free journey together. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Shame Free Sex podcast. Today, I am joined by Lucy Rowett, and Lucy is a certified sexologist and sex coach with a specialty in working with women and people with vulvas who come from faith backgrounds who are struggling to let go of sexual shame and enjoy pleasurable and intimate relationships again. And in today's episode, Lucy is going to be sharing about overcoming religious sexual shame. And this topic is so prevalent in our world and just so important. So I'm so glad that you are here to help guide us and share your wisdom with us today, Lucy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to exploring this topic and sharing what I can.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm always excited to see people who specialize in this topic, and I think it's something so many of us are affected by even without realizing a lot of times. So,
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear what you have to say today. And before we get into all of the details and healing and all of the things, I'd love if we could learn a little bit more about you. Could you tell us about your background and how you came to work with religious sexual shame?
Awesome. So my background, you might be able to tell I'm British. I come originally from London. That's where I grew up, though I haven't lived in London in a long time. I grew up in the 2000s in a church family. And I always say that the Christianity and the evangelicalism in the UK is a slightly different flavor to what it is in the US, in that it's not quite as baked into our culture. But not just both sides of my family are very religious. When I was a teen, I very much took on the religion for myself and not realizing that I was being heavily influenced by the evangelical world, the evangelical sphere. Because you're a teenager, you don't know. You just think you're going to church. You just think Christianity is Christianity. And as part of that, going to youth groups, going to worship events, being involved in young Christian life, and being heavily influenced by evangelicalism, that also meant that I got a big, heavy dose of purity culture. And in the US, people might be super familiar with that. In the UK, it's not quite as well known. And also, the thing about purity culture is that it kind of is what it says on the tin. It's never just one talk or one sermon or one podcast. No, we didn't have podcasts back then. It's continuous. It's baked into the culture. It seeps into every conversation. It seeps into the attitudes. It seeps into the worship groups and the prayer groups that you have. So much so that you don't, certainly I didn't fully realize how immersed I was in it and how much I'd internalized these beliefs, because I just thought that's just the way it is. Especially again, as both sides of my family, both sides are very religious. Luckily, they're I guess, the nice kind of religious, not the like thumping you with the Bible, you're going to hell religious. But still, it's very much features in both sides of my family, and it's the ecosystem in which I was brought up in. And then eventually in my teens, I then had very serious chronic illness, plus a lot of things. I eventually left my faith. And part of faith deconstruction was then realizing, so I always thought that like sex was bad and shouldn't do it. But like, now I don't believe this. And I explore this. And I didn't realize how much shame I still carried. Um, Also, at the same time as this, even when I was super religious and super into my faith, I've always been a very highly sexual person, or I've always had a high desire, a high interest in sex. But then I had to learn to squash that down. And especially when you're coming of age and your hormones are doing what they do, and there's so many conflicting messages, I didn't realize how damaging it was for me to feel like I had to and be taught that I had to just squash it down, get on it, try not to do it. Um, and so, as part of that journey, both in faith deconstruction, in healing my body as well, because at one point I was very severely chronically ill. I was confined to a wheelchair and in beds. It was also exploring my own sexuality, because it was that thing of, oh, so I don't believe it's bad anymore. So do I do? And I didn't realize how much I still carried. I remember the first time I had sex, my sexual debut. I didn't lose my virginity because I didn't lose anything. I remember looking in the mirror thinking, am I somehow dirty now? Am I somehow changed because I've had a penis inside me? So that echo was still there. And so I, what was it? I got into Tantra and sacred sexuality, which I always say was like my gateway drug outside of Christianity. And I'm very critical of some aspects of that world, even though I'm very grateful for it. And being in my early to mid 20s, I was working with a recovery coach at the time and being very wide eyed and very like, wow, this world's amazing. I thought, I'll become a sex coach, which, I'm really grateful to that younger part of me who just kind of went for something. I found a training I really liked. And I'm really glad that the sex coach training I did, it also really helped with a lot of not just faith deconstruction, but untangling so many of the shaming messages I'd received in purity culture in church settings. Yeah, it was so helpful, especially learning a lot of the science and the studies behind it. And it was a big part of my own healing process. And that's kind of how I came to do this work, realizing that I really love working with people from faith backgrounds. And I say not just Christianity, although obviously that is my own slant. That's my own, what is it, my own bias, but I don't, there's no predominant world religion that is overtly sex positive and sex affirming. They all have different strains of purity culture. They might use different semantics and different phrases, but pretty much the same thing. And this is what I love to work with in helping women and people of vulvas in not just de-shaming, but making their bodies a safe space again and making their sexuality a safe space again.
Yes. Oh, that was so beautifully said, and thank you for being open to sharing so many different aspects of your own journey and how you came into this work. And I just think it's always so exciting to hear about people who work with these specific things that can really like dive into this one specific area that people might be struggling with, such as religious sexual shame, and find guidance with that. So I'm so excited to hear more from you today and about the work you do and the messages you share. And you just now mentioned that purity culture can be prevalent in most different sorts of religions. And so, could you just tell us about maybe some of the most common teachings around sexuality that come up in religious teachings and how those might differ a little bit between different religions?
I'll do my best. And again, I want to say that my own bias is Christianity. And while I say that there's no major religion that is overtly sex positive or sex affirming, I also know that each religion has got like a small part of sex positivity within it. There's like a subset within it. And I also want to say that you do not have to leave your religion or your faith beliefs or your faith tradition in order to heal and work with your sexuality, but you will need to deconstruct a lot of the harmful beliefs. Um, so again, from a Christian standpoint, when I say the term purity culture, I say it with an American accent, which I think is really funny because I'm British. Purity culture, purity culture. The purity culture that I come from and that we know of pretty much originally comes from the US. It sort of came as a reaction to the 1960s sexual revolution and really gained steam in the 1980s and 1990s. It was very much a reactionary movement. So it popularized, damn it, words, by movements like True Love Waits, which was, I think it was something around having a purity ring. It was popularized by authors like Joshua Harris, who's also completely come out and denounced everything that he's taught and depublished the book. But it's a set of teachings, not just that sex is bad, because they always say, no, sex is brilliant, but only within the confines of a God ordained marriage between one man and one woman. They'll be teaching a lot of myths about how dangerous sex can be, how it can really damage you, that any kind of sexual behavior outside of holy matrimony between one man and one woman is a sin, it's bad, it's dangerous. But also, there's a lot of policing of your own thoughts and desires, because, of course, a lot of us have horny thoughts and horny desires. So there's a lot of teaching in order to be holy, in order to be godly, you need to squash those down. Masturbation, of course, out of bounds, terrible. It's a slippery slope. And of course, anything outside of being heterosexual is also really, really frowned upon or seen as bad. So for queer folk, for trans folk, they're either just completely ignored, or most of the time they're taught that it's a sin and you have to pray that away too. Now, there are maybe if you come from this and you might not resonate with a lot of it. I think it's really important to understand that even if you weren't taught all of it, it still exists. In this idea of sex having some sort of morality and some sort of spiritual value attached to it, where your sexual behavior or your sexual desires, anything is intrinsically tied to your spiritual value, potentially what happens to you in the afterlife, your relationship with God, your quote unquote purity as a person. And I think that's really important to understand. In terms of other religions, I'm not an expert. I know Islam, I know Hinduism, Orthodox Judaism teach very, very similar things. They might have slight variations, in terms of, I know that within Orthodox Judaism, there's a lot of emphasis on encouraging married couples to pleasure each other, which is a great thing. But again, the same themes of premarital sex bad, huge emphasis on virginity, especially for girls and women, a huge emphasis on gender roles and how women should behave versus how men should behave, a huge emphasis on right sexual behavior and right versus wrong sexual behavior. And that's a whole other topic in itself, especially when you, I'm going to say, demonize certain sexual behaviors and desires as sinful, as bad. Call it what you want. You can use whatever semantics you want to, but when you label certain sexual behaviors, or usually a very small section of sexual behaviors, as good and everything else is bad, well, that's not how humans work.
Yeah.
I always find it interesting the mental gymnastics that some religious folks will say to say, no, we believe sex is amazing, but only between God ordained marriage. And I'm trying to think, but that's not how the human sexual subconscious works.
Yeah.
Especially, it's not how it works, especially when it's a very human thing to get turned on by the things we're not supposed to be turned on by.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that makes it even more appealing to us. And also within purity culture, there is often much more emphasis on the way that girls and women behave, on the way that girls and women dress, as opposed to boys and men. There is often much heavier policing on the way that women and girls dress and behave and act than there is on boys and men. Not to say that boys and men get it lightly either. They definitely don't. So that's my brief explanation of purity culture. And of course, every country is going to have a different flavor of it, because I know in the US, religion is much more baked into the overall culture. I'm saying this very broadly because the US
Yeah.
has many different states and many different cultures, but it's very much more baked into your politics, into the laws that are made.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, not quite as much. Maybe it's like purity culture light, like diet purity culture or something.
Diet
I
beer.
don't know. And again, it's going to be different in other countries as well, because it also interacts with the culture you're in. Whereas in countries maybe like Brazil or like very conservative countries, it's going to be amplified because it's going to be reflected by the culture you live in. And that's also not, discounting racial factors as well. I'm a white woman. I know that I got very different messages and experiences from a Black British woman going to gospel church. So there's lots of different intersections and things as well. I say it's all different awful flavors of the same awful ice cream. It's all shaming, it's all controlling, and it's all erotophobia, in a fear and a suppression of the erotic.
Yeah. Yeah, you described that so well. And even just that somewhat brief explanation, I think there was so much information packed into there and realizations, perhaps people listening, recognizing some of the ways in which they were affected. And I'm even wondering, you did describe how purity culture is so prevalent in the US and just kind of baked, as you said, into some of the culture. And I'm
Mm.
wondering, even if someone didn't grow up religiously, could they still have been affected by these purity culture concepts if it was such a societal factor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one thing to think of from a very practical perspective, maybe you didn't grow up religious, but your parents might have done, and your grandparents almost certainly, in terms of we're not that removed from the generations that it was a normal cultural thing to be going to church every single week and for it to be baked into your community. But also, it's baked into laws that are made, into legislation that's made. It's baked into a lot of the medical system. And I say the medical system because, even 100, 150 years ago, how we practice medicine is very different now. And I say this as a layperson, I'm not a medical professional, but a lot of the attitudes around sexuality were baked into how they practiced medicine, into how they treated patients, into how they worked with patients. You also, in terms of culture, maybe you didn't grow up religious, but you probably went to school with people that did. Um, you probably have an experience of a friend that maybe tried to get you to go to a church group, which was basically to try and get you to go to church with them. In pop culture as well, we see, a lot like the Jonas Brothers, Miley Cyrus, where they talked about their purity rings when they were young. It's also really impacted in the media in terms of not that the media is religious, but the moralistic views around sexuality is very reflected in the media. And we might not think that, especially when we might be used to very overly sexualized images. But, in the UK, we've got a tabloid called the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail, I think it's available in the US as well. Of course, it's not overtly religious, but we know the slant is very anti-women. It's very slut-shaming. Whenever they do a negative story about a woman or a female celebrity, it's often referencing her sexual history or something really negative about her sexuality. I think when we're understanding purity culture and the influence in society, it's not just what is overtly taught, but either what is unsaid or the biases that affect it. Even as simple as believing that you are somebody more moral because maybe you don't do certain sexual behaviors. Um, there's so many tangents I can go on in this, but to understand that it's 2025 today, we are not that far removed from our grandparents being heavily religious. And that still is trickling down and being felt today. Again, in laws that are made, in politicians' rhetoric, which we are very much seeing in many different countries.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much for diving down that path a little bit and just explaining how prevalent this is in the media, in our friends, perhaps if we didn't grow up religious, our grandparents, our parents, our schools, even. I moved to the South in the United States. I moved to the South when I was in middle school, and that it was completely different.
Yeah.
It's very heavily Christian here, and just the way that they spoke in the schools, the sex education that was taught in the schools, all of that was very much
Yeah.
slanted in that direction. So all of these things that likely affected me, affected others without us even having a real true realization of the effect of it. And so with
No.
that being said, how do you find that this religious sexual shame shows up for people both inside and outside of the bedroom?
Sometimes the most obvious can be when, supposing you have gotten married, supposing you've done all of the right things, and it's either your wedding night or you're getting down with your husband or wife, and you take your clothes off and you freeze because you've been taught for so long that this is bad, that you need to cover up, to not touch yourself. And suddenly you're trying to be intimate with your partner. And what happens is maybe you freeze, maybe you dissociate, maybe you just have no idea what it is to ask for, or what you can ask for, or what you want in the first place. It can often look like going up into your head and feeling a bit like you're not quite there in your body. I've had a lot of times where often the first few times people have been sexually active, or it can be for many, many years, where it's just a feeling of not quite being connected to their body, a feeling of dissociation. Because again, when you're taught for so long that you can't really be in your body, that your body is sinful, that we need to, what's it, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. When it comes to sex, it can come to not being able to feel much pleasure, especially for women and those socialized as female, not feeling like you actually deserve to have pleasure or that you can ask for what you want. Even if you left the faith before getting married, it can sometimes look like getting into sex or relationship situations that are quite disempowered because you weren't taught about boundaries, you weren't taught about consent. You weren't taught that you're allowed to say no to things. You weren't taught that some things that happen in sex are not okay because it was never talked about. And sometimes that can often leave people very vulnerable. And it can also leave people vulnerable if you weren't taught about contraception and how important it is to use contraception or even practice barrier methods like using a condom. So that can put you into very risky situations as well when you don't have that felt sense or some sense of this is what I like, this is what I don't like, this is not okay. Also, on a very, I say, practical physical level, we know that there are quite a few studies that demonstrate that women who come from conservative or religious backgrounds tend to report higher rates of things like vaginismus and vaginal pain, which to me, again, makes a lot of sense because vaginismus in general is more psychosomatic. It's not in your head. It's absolutely not in your head. It's a physical thing, but it's triggered by a stress response. And it makes sense when I think even if you don't grow up religious, we all have a lot of cultural baggage around our vulvas and vaginas. When we're having sex, we are the most vulnerable we could be. We are naked. We are letting for a woman or somebody with a vulva, you're letting somebody into your body. It makes a lot of sense that your body might still hold on to that threat or feel that there's a threat going on. And it can look like inability to have an orgasm, all sorts of things. It can also just manifest as a feeling of overall, I say, shame and inhibition. So for some people, they're very aware that they still feel very, very inhibited. And the thing about shame and inhibition, I often feel like it's a very thick, heavy suit of armor that you don't always realize how much you're carrying. You just know that your body feels heavy and that you feel yourself shrinking and you feel embarrassed. You feel like you're stuck in your head. You feel all of these things, and then you feel frustration and guilt that you can't get over it. I think it's really important to understand how shame and trauma and the threat response work in our bodies to take a lot of the blame out of it because you might consciously not believe some of these things anymore, but your body would probably not agree with you. Your body might still be holding on to it. And I see this a lot. But it can also show up in other ways. And one of the non-sexual ways that I think people don't often realize is not being able to ask for what you want in general and finding it hard to really believe and embody that you're allowed to have wants and needs in the first place. Again, a lot of religious teachings, especially to women, is very much around submission, very much around not my will, but God's will, very, very tied up in gender roles. And so this can show up in many places, not just in the bedroom, where I say not even knowing that you're allowed to have wants and needs, it not always occurring to you in the first place. And it can look like, you could say, codependent relationships. It can look like just struggling to have boundaries, feeling like people are walking all over you. When there's so much pressure to be a good woman, to be a good person, and that you can only keep that up for so long. And it can be really, really damaging. And it can also look up, I remember I was interviewing for a chapter I was writing on purity culture. Even if you leave that belief system, like a hypervigilance around your body, like, am I wearing something too revealing? It's like a default response, even if you don't believe it anymore. Okay, I'm bending over. Can they see my ass or can they see my boobs? That real hypervigilance and self-consciousness around your body, even if consciously you're telling yourself, it's fine, I don't have to believe this anymore. It still doesn't feel good. I still don't feel good about that. I think there's so many ways it can show up. But I think one of the most important things to remember is that feeling of shame and shoulding in not allowing yourself or feeling allowed to fully express who you are and what you want. Because for so long you've been taught that your sexuality and who you are as a person has to fit into this very small and narrow box when this doesn't fit most humans. And learning to come out of that box, especially if you're queer or sure that you're definitely not straight, that can take a huge toll on your psyche. And I also want to say that healing and recovery, it can take a long time. and it's actually good when it does take a long time. Anybody who says, yep, you can heal in, I don't know, 5 weeks or whatever, that's not sustainable. It takes a while for the body and the mind to get on board with each other. So yeah, these are just a few ways it can show up.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like there's countless ways that this can show up for people and in so many different areas as well. You shared some that are, of course, specifically related to our sexuality and our sexual experiences, and all of the ways that that can carry over outside of the bedroom, whether that be advocating for ourselves, standing up for our wants and needs, or even knowing or being aware of our wants and needs, like you mentioned. And I also really appreciate you just now saying how this can be a rather slow process and it's not going to be a quick fix like we like to wish almost everything to be an
Yeah.
immediate fix.
If it could
So
just be quick, that would be great. No,
yeah,
it doesn't work.
yeah, a one journal prompt and I'm good. I'm fixed. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so what would you say to someone who's just starting to question their religious conditioning around
Mm.
sex and wants to begin to heal? What would you say to someone in that place?
I'm always a big fan of education because it's a relatively low investment of your time, of your energy, and even money. So books, buying like books around sexuality education, and depending if you're married and your spouse is supportive, maybe even a Christian sex therapist would recommend these books as well. But education in terms of learning or unlearning the really negative messages you would have learned. And I also say that education is important because it starts to get our mind on board. And whenever we want to make changes and do healing, it's generally a good place to get our minds on board first. It gives our minds something to latch onto. So, like I recommend books like Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, Sex for One by Betty Dodson. I'm just thinking of all the books I have on my bookshelf. The Woman's Anatomy of Arousal by Sherry Winston. There's so many different books that you can buy. And if you're not sure, just pick the one that looks most appealing to you and start there. And start to feed your mind first, because that's going to start to help give yourself permission to then explore other things. If you can, finding people that are more affirming, doesn't have to be a whole community. It could be groups, it could be workshops, it could be going to events, but starting to meet people outside of your regular circle, especially if your regular circle is still very religious, because you're probably not going to get new ideas there. And also, if you start mixing with more secular people or getting more secular information, it will also bust a lot of myths that you've probably been taught around people who aren't religious. I know that when I was a Christian, I definitely, obviously, I was a lot younger as well, but I had a lot of ideas about people who weren't Christian that are definitely not true today. I also, a really important thing is you can start exploring your body by yourself, whether you could be in the bath or the shower. It could just be, what's the word? Like caressing yourself using really lovely body cream, knowing that if you're on your own, you can take all the time that you want to. Maybe you do want to start exploring self-pleasuring. Again, there's books like Orgasmic Yoga that could be helpful to start to reframe that self-pleasuring is something good. Another thing, I think there are quite a few like influencers on Instagram. I mean, from a Christian perspective, there's a few like sex positive Christian influencers that are really helpful, or sex positive Christian authors or therapists. That also, I'm sure there must be more sex positive, like Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Hindu, as a way for you to build that bridge. Okay, if they're saying that, then it must be true. Um, else? I had a whole list in my head and it's gone out of my mind now. I'd also say start to, whether it's working with a coach or a therapist, start to build more of that self-trust, that you can trust your body and you can trust yourself. A lot of religions or high demand groups, which are known as cults, they teach you to not trust yourself, to not trust what your body's telling you, to not trust your emotions. And I would fly in the face of that. You have to learn to start trusting yourself and trusting your decisions, especially how your body communicates with you. So, again, it could be working with a coach or a therapist. It could be just making that decision to journal every day to start really starting to trust yourself again. There's so many things. It can also be regular journaling to explore the beliefs that you learned that you know are not helpful for you anymore. It could be going to sex shops and exploring. I'd always say, like, take your time and know that you're in the driver's seat. Try not to put like a date in terms of if I'm not fully fixed by this date, it's never going to happen. Don't try not to put pressure on yourself. I always say some of the biggest healing that can happen is knowing that you're in the driver's seat. It's your body, you are in full control, and you get to choose how far you go. And sometimes that can be far more healing than doing a whole weekend's worth of intensive tantra. Maybe you do want to explore. I think for some people, when they're leaving that belief system, it's really normal to completely want to ricochet to the other side. And that's normal and okay as well. Or maybe you don't want to, but know that it's completely okay if you do decide to just go completely wild and explore everything you were told you weren't allowed to do. And know that you won't stay there either. I think it's important to, it's not often it's not often talked about as much that when you leave a very strict set of beliefs, it's very normal to then kind of to the other side and go to the other extreme because you haven't learned that inner break, that inner sense of this doesn't feel good to me. And also know that whatever scene you get involved with, whether it's like a sex positive scene or a more sacred sexuality scene, know that you do not have to be into everything. A big part of this is knowing what you don't like and having boundaries and saying no to things. Please don't believe this myth taught in some circles that in order to be sexually healed or liberated or sex positive, that you have to be into everything, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that really, really, really important reminder right there at the end, as well as just all of those different suggestions, little and practical steps that people can take to start exploring, start figuring out how they can move forward and overcome some of their religious sexual shame. It was great to hear the array of different options and opportunities people can start taking those baby steps with.
Oh, there's one more thing I forgot to
Yeah.
add as well. It's depending on where you are. For some people, when they leave a certain belief system, they want to throw out all spirituality altogether, and that's completely legit and okay. Or depending on where you are, maybe you want to explore other forms of spirituality or spiritual practice where your sexuality is affirmed. And that can look very different for lots of people. Again, you could stay within your belief system. You could explore more spirituality things. A lot of people love sacred sexuality and tantra for that. And there's pros and cons to that. But knowing that you get to form a new spiritual practice in whatever way that looks like to you, and I often think that's really important when you come from a faith background, that of reclaiming some sort of spiritual practice or even just throwing it out altogether as a way of starting to heal some of that rift where you were taught that you can't be sexual and spiritual when you can absolutely be both.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that as well. I think that's so important for anyone who, still does align with their belief system or still wants to be a part of that in some way, knowing that it is possible to be sexual and spiritual and that those two
mm,
can integrate and go together. That's really
mm.
exciting as well. Yes. And so I'm just wondering, what do you, I guess, kind of an ultimate question, what do you wish more people understood about religious sexual shame and how it might actually be different from other kinds of shame?
I think it's, I think if I'm talking especially to like therapists or other practitioners or people from this background as well, I think it's really important for whoever you're working with to have an understanding of how these teachings work. It's like if I'm talking to other therapists or coaches, I always say that religious sexual shame, it's not the same flavor as other forms of trauma or whatever. You really need to understand some of the belief system and how deeply it can go. Like whatever religion you are part of or that you come from, usually the more personally involved you are in it, of course, the more it's going to affect you. It's really important to understand that, when I was interviewing someone for the book chapter again, she said, most people in society have some degree of sexual shame. But then when you add in like the fear for your eternal soul,
Yeah.
that this potential punishment isn't just going to be for this life, but for all your future lives or eternal soul. And that is hugely existential. And so religious sexual shame can very much tie into feelings around our survival, around who you are as a person, and that it's very tied into it's not just things you think and believe, it's a filter through which you see the world and through which you see yourself. So that's what I'd say. I think, especially if you either if you're a practitioner and you're working with clients from a religious background, some of the tools that you've learned aren't going to be enough. You need to understand some of the background and belief system. And if you come from this belief system, know that sometimes you might need something more specialist, like affirming spaces to help you really, I was going to say, detox a lot of these really unhelpful beliefs. Because especially if you're in more secular groups, people might not fully understand the real literal fear of hell that you might have
Yeah.
of having these beliefs or having these faiths, or having these beliefs. So that's what I'd say. Get some specialist support or be in some specialist spaces for that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Even like Reddit threads can be quite helpful as one starting point. I'm not saying all Reddit threads are great. Use your own discernment.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's some great ex-evangelical, ex-Mormon, ex-JW, ex many other things that might be a place of normalization for you to be like, oh, thank fuck, it wasn't just me who was taught this really weird thing. It
Yeah.
can really normalize it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know what to expect with your answer there, and I think that is so important to keep in mind when it comes to religious sexual shame. It relates to a lot of people's entire perception of life itself and all of these different things that are coming into play, and there's so many different factors and deep, deep, deep emotions I would imagine at play. So thank you for sharing a little
Yeah.
bit about that. And then I would just love to know, how do you define healthy or shame-free sexuality today? What would be your definition?
It's a good one. I'm going through my mental file effects of thing. I think that when we're talking about healthy sexuality, I often think that's a play on words in itself. I'm very, very careful to define what is healthy sexuality because a lot of people will say, this is healthy sexuality, this is not. And usually by saying that, it's like defining certain sexual behaviors. Throw that shit out. In my opinion, healthy sexuality is something that feels true to you. I think it was either Dan Savage or some other podcast, somebody who said it. And it's this idea of, does it give you life? Does it make you feel energized? Does it make you feel like you're coming home to yourself? Or does it make you shrink? Does it deplete your energy? Does it take things away from you? And can you use that barometer for anything that you try? Um, what did you say? Healthy sexuality and something else?
Shame-free sexuality.
Shame, shame. Okay. It's funny because I think my definition today might be different to what I would have said it was like a few years ago. I want to say that shame-free sexuality does not mean that you have to be posting nudes of yourself online to show how shame-free you are. It doesn't have to be like that. The way I often feel it and define it is a sense of feeling completely okay with your body and your sexuality. And of course, that's going to vary, but remembering that a lot of religious teachings teach us inherently that there's something wrong with us, that there's something bad about touching our vulvas or our genitals. I believe that shame-free sexuality is when you can hold yourself and touch yourself and either know or feel on some level that this is good, this is yummy, I'm a wonderful, juicy, I'm a gorgeous, sexy, wonderful person and I love and approve of every part of myself. My vulva's delicious. It tastes wonderful. I love my boobs. Of course, you're going to have we all have days with our bodies where we feel shit about our bodies because that's diet culture, but more of a sense of this is something yummy and delicious and gives me life and is a part of who I am. And I really love and accept everything about who I am, knowing that it's going to change as well. It doesn't have to look a certain way. Um, Maybe it will. Maybe for you, shame-free sexuality will be doing nude dancing and whatever, and that go for that if that feeds you. So maybe my answer to that is, does this feed me? Does this give me life? Does it make me feel like I'm really landing in my body? Does it make me feel like it's true to myself? Or does it feel extractive? Does it feel like it's taking something from me?
Yeah.
And only you are going to know what that is. But
Mhm.
remember that healthy sexuality or shame-free sexuality does not have a look. It doesn't mean you have to be monogamous or non-monogamous or swinging. It doesn't have to look any certain way. You don't have to be vanilla. You don't have to be kinky. It's what feels true to me.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. That's such a good answer because of course there is not one size fits all when it comes to really anything, but especially
No.
our sexuality. It's such a vast thing, so many different flavors and just all the things. So thank you so much for that beautiful message. And I would love if we could talk a little bit about how people can dive deeper with you, Lucy, and the beautiful work that you do. Anything that you'd
So
like to share with us today about how people can find you, work with you, explore what you do?
awesome. So, first of all, I have a podcast called The Naked and Ashamed Life. It's on Apple, Spotify, sometimes on Substack when I remember to cross post it, sometimes on YouTube, but mostly Apple and Spotify. I also have a free gift which I shared with you, and it's a practice called Feel Again, and it's a practice to connect with your vulva. So this practice is for women and people with vulvas only, because if you're a man or you have a penis, you might not resonate with it. And it's a practice to befriend your vulva and to learn how to start feeling again, especially if sex is somewhere where you felt very numb, very tripped out, like what I described earlier. You feel that you're stuck in your head, you can't enjoy sex. I always say that the first place to start is learning to feel it or learning to feel your vulva as opposed to, right, I need to have more orgasms. So that's, and it will also put you onto my mailing list. On Instagram, for now, I haven't been kicked off yet at Lucy Rowett. It's always a thing with sex educators on Instagram. It's not a very sex friendly place. I'm on Substack. Find me on my website, lucyrowett.com. We can explore working together one to one. I run various different group programs. We're just finishing up the current iteration of Body Bliss in a couple of weeks. I'm probably going to run it again. Yeah, I'd love you to get in contact with me and see how I can support you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing about how people can find you, see what you are up to. And as a reminder to everyone listening and or watching as well, you can head over to the show notes and check out Lucy's website from there, explore that free gift, all of the awesome things that Lucy has to offer. And
Thank you.
then, are there any final insights or a final message that you'd like to share today, Lucy?
Now my brain's gone blank. You probably remember when we finish. I would say that remember that your sexuality and your body belong to you. They were not, they don't belong to God or to somebody else. They belong to you. And the more you can start to embody that sense of belonging to yourself, that sense that this is something good and something wonderful, that is really going to help. Actually, I can think of a final thought, and it's that in a lot of religious settings, they often say how sex is sacred. But the way that they talk about how sex is sacred, it's from a perspective that it's so sacred we must hide it and shut it down and do this. When I say sex is sacred, I believe in the sacredness or the sanctity as something joyous and life-giving and essential to life and something to be celebrated and enjoyed and savored. That's how I view sacredness,
Yeah.
sacred, whatever, sanctity, whatever, whatever the noun is, that's how I view it. And so, what if you could start to switch your mindset from that sacred means something joyful and wonderful and gives you life?
Yes. I love that. I love that you brought it back around to that, defining what brings us life and joy and fills us up, fills our cups. So thank you so much for sharing so much amazing wisdom about overcoming religious sexual shame today and just being
Thank
here
you.
on the podcast with me, Lucy.
Thank you so much for asking me.
Yes, absolutely. It was so great speaking with you. And to our shame-free listeners, thank you for being here with us today and taking one more step in embracing your most authentic shame-free self. Stay sexy, stay safe, stay curious. Take care, everyone. Explore more at shamefreesex.com. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you never miss out on another episode. Bye, everyone.